Don't try to learn pronunciation by reading. Instead, the best way to improve is to listen to and mimic native speakers. Focusing too much on how sounds are written down can actually make it harder to hear them. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to expand on something I touched on briefly in the previous week's Q&A, namely about learning Chinese pronunciation by focusing on listening and mimicking, not on reading. When I say reading here, I mostly mean pinyin, but in general, if you try to learn the sounds and tones of Mandarin, you should spend most of your time listening to said sounds and tones, not reading them written down on a page. This is true even if you've mastered the spelling rules in pinyin, because pinyin is just a way of labeling the sounds. It's not actually a description of those sounds, and that is in fact rather hard to write down in the first place. There needs to be some kind of somewhat arbitrary connection between the spoken sounds and the written symbols. And the best way to avoid being confused by this mapping is to skip it entirely and go directly to the sounds and tones and listen to them. So in this week's episode, we're going to discuss why it's a bad idea to focus too much on reading pronunciation and why you should listen and mimic instead. I focus a bit extra on pronunciation now because there is a pronunciation challenge in October, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes, and there is also a discount available for my pronunciation course that lasts until the end of this week. This is a video course that will help you acquire natural and clear pronunciation in Mandarin, including all the sounds and tones, and of course also how these are written down. Those are two completely different things. So on the one hand, we have the sounds and tones that native speakers use to communicate with each other and that make up the language, and then we have written symbols that we use to refer to these sounds. When you think about it, these are clearly different things. One of them is sound waves traveling through the air, and the other is lines written on a piece of paper. When I put it like that, I think it should be fairly obvious that being good at one of them does not necessarily mean that you're good at the other, and that studying one of them might not get you anywhere when it comes to learning the other either. Naturally, to be able to use Chinese in everyday situations for communicative purposes, you need to know both. You obviously need the spoken sounds and tones themselves to be able to hear what other people say and to be able to pronounce Mandarin yourself, but you also need to know how these are written down, for example, if you want to type something or if you want to look up the pronunciation of a character. However, this only works if you've mastered how the transcription system works, and the most common transcription system here is pinyin. One way to look at transcription systems is to say that it is a little bit like having a box with a label on it. So we have a box, we put some rice in it, and we put a label on the box that says rice. Then we take a second box and we put sugar in it, and now we also stick a label on that box that says sugar. It should be obvious here that the labels where it says rice and sugar are not themselves rice and sugar. They are just referring to those substances being stored in these boxes. Pinyin and other transcription systems work pretty much like this too. We have different sounds in the spoken language and we put them in different boxes and we stick a label to each box. So in pinyin we can take the syllable hao and split it into three different boxes. We have one with an H on it, one with an A on it, and one with an O on it. Or if you prefer, we can treat A and O together as a final and put it in one box together and write AO on it. We can then also take the tone and either put it in its own box or put it together with the final. We could also use other transcription systems such as zhuyin that I'm going to talk about more in an upcoming episode, but it would essentially be the same thing. The only difference is that we write different things on these labels, but the underlying sounds are the same. And in both cases, it should be equally clear that what is written on the label is not the same thing as being contained in that box. If we continue with the analogy with rice and sugar, if you're hungry, you cannot eat the label where it says rice on it, won't do any good. And if you're craving something sweet, putting a piece of paper on which the word sugar is written will not work either. The crux is that we have grown up with spoken and written language, and we've seen these links so many times, and they are so reinforced that we sometimes forget that the spoken sounds and the written symbols are two different things. This is not a problem if we're sticking only to one language, but it can be a problem when we learn a foreign language, such as Mandarin. The problem then is that we keep using the same labels, and that will lead us to believe that the sounds contained in the boxes with these labels are the same, but they are not. at least not most of the time. As mentioned briefly already, there are also several rules you need to know about for how pinyin is written, and if you don't know these, you might end up misinterpreting the labels altogether. So let's have a look at a few examples of how the labeling can confuse you as a learner of Chinese. So first, you might learn how to say ni with a dipping tone and then assume that that is the same pronunciation as in other words that contain this ni, but this is not the case. When followed by another third tone, the first one is changed into a rising tone, as in ni hao, so it's clearly not pronounced the same way here, even though the label is the same. Something similar happens when it's followed by anything else, in which case the third tone is just a low tone. So for example, if you want to say you say, it would be ni shuo, so the ni is just low. Again, the label indicates that these three tones would be pronounced the same way, but they are not. Another example might be the final spelled with an I, such as in li, force, which is different from the final also spelled with I in words such as shi. If you mix up the labels here and don't listen to what people actually say, you might therefore end up pronouncing shi to be as she or something similar. And this is indeed a rather common pronunciation error. Another example that causes a lot of confusion is the final spelled with a U. So in the spoken language, we have two completely different sounds. We have U and we have Ü, and so these should clearly be two separate boxes as they are two different sounds. However, as it happens, in some cases we use the same label for these two boxes, and then as a student you need to know which box this label refers to. This is not too complicated, at least not when compared to spelling in, say, English or French. So on one box, the one with U in it, we only have one label, and that is a U. This means that this sound is only written this way, and there is no risk for ambiguity. However, we have put the Ü sound in a different box because it is a different sound in Mandarin, and this one actually has two labels on it. It has a normal U, and then it also has a U with two dots on it. So you need to know when to use which and when other people use which as well. And the rule here is pretty simple. When Ü comes after J, Q, X, and Y, it is written without the dots, just a normal U. And in other cases it's written with the two dots, and that is mainly when it comes after N and L. So a common thing for learners to do is to interpret the labels used in Mandarin, i.e. pinyin here, as if they were English or some other language that you've studied. You simply assume that T means T, that U means U, and that I means I. But as we have seen, this is very rarely the case. Some of these are obviously different sounds. I mean, if you listen to them, shi and she sound quite different. They are not even remotely the same type of sound. But there are also more subtle differences. So for example, if we take the U sound that I mentioned in the last example, say in a word like shu, meaning book, many English speakers pronounce this as shu, because there is no sound that corresponds to the U sound, so we just pick one that is close enough. Unless this new sound you're saying overlaps with another sound in Mandarin, your Chinese might not be much harder to understand as a result of this, but it will give you a clear English accent when speaking Chinese. If you want many more examples of how pinyin can lead students astray, check out episode 76, A Guide to Pinyin Traps and Pitfalls. Naturally, my course also discusses this because I do bring up common learner errors and problems with the sounds and tones I discuss. So what I want to convince you of in this episode is that you should learn Mandarin pronunciation by listening to how native speakers speak, not how these sounds are written down. The first problem we've discussed now is that if you haven't learned this mapping or this labeling system properly, it will lead to errors because of this. However, it is important to not rely on a labeling system even if you learn it properly. There is substantial research into how orthography, how we write things down, or spelling if you will, influences what we actually hear. This essentially then means that if you see something on the page, that can influence what sounds you think you are hearing. I think it's not too hard to see why this would be a problem. For example, if we take the initial spelled sh, as in sh, as we discussed earlier, that sound is not pronounced the same in, say, Mandarin shi and English she. These are two different sounds, but they are written the same way. Now, the difference is not astronomical, but if you see the letters SH every time you hear this sound, your brain is likely to hear this as being the same sound, depending a little bit on how the native speaker pronounces it, of course. But the point is that if you see a label, you automatically associate it with some sound that you are used to based on languages you have studied previously, not on what the person is actually saying in this new language, Mandarin in our case. So if we keep using the same syllable, shi, and we look at the final instead this time, I think this is a clear example of where people pronounce this based on how it's written on the page and not how people pronounce it. This often results in students pronouncing this as she or something to that effect. While I don't think this has been investigated experimentally, I'm quite sure that the number of people who say she would go down drastically if we only taught students through listening, if they were not able to see this written down at all and just had to mimic what people said. In last week's episode, I went through how to pronounce this final correctly, and I also mentioned that you might not get the pronunciation right simply by mimicking, because this is a rather unusual sound that doesn't exist in English, and so it might require some practice beyond just listening. But the point here is that I think it's highly unlikely that many students will end up with the pronunciation she if they hear the sound sh and are asked to mimic it. So this brings us back to the point of this episode, which is to encourage you to learn pronunciation by listening and mimicking. Listening should be pretty obvious. We have the sounds in the boxes, and listening then is experiencing these sounds directly. You don't necessarily care about the label on the box, you just care about what's in the box, and you don't need a label for that. In fact, as we have seen, having a label on the box before you open it might change what you hear when you are listening to the sound in that box. While you can get very far simply by listening and paying attention, mimicking is the best way to learn to say these things yourself, because it combines attentive listening, you have to listen to the person you're mimicking, and then you try to say the same thing yourself, and you can also easily compare. I went into much more detail about how to mimic and why in episode 162, which is a video episode. It is in fact a lesson from the pronunciation course, so you can check it out in the description of this episode or go to YouTube. While I'm recommending resources outside of this episode, you should also make sure you have access to a good pinyin chart, and I recommend the one published by All Set Learning, and I'll put links to these in the show notes as well. Having access to good sound references as a beginner is, as I've said, essential. When you encounter a new word, you should never guess how it is pronounced based on the pinyin, because as we have seen, these labels might not describe the things you think they are. So if you encounter a syllable you're not sure how it's pronounced, well, look it up in this pinyin chart and you will have the audio there along with tones. If you want more resources for listening directly to spoken Mandarin, check out the links in the show notes. So to recap briefly, we have seen that there are two things you need to learn. You need to learn the sounds we put in the boxes, and we then also need to learn the labels we put on the boxes and the relationship between the two. This means that if you get something wrong, there could in fact be several things going on. Maybe you've misunderstood how the sound is pronounced in itself, or maybe you've misunderstood how the labeling system works, or the link between the labels and the sounds that they are supposed to describe. As a teacher, when I give feedback to people who take my pronunciation course, I can sometimes not know which one it is based only on one example, but if you probe a little bit more deeply, it's rather easy to figure out which is the problem. Has the student misunderstood when it's supposed to be ü or u, or is it that they actually can't pronounce the ü sound? And as you can imagine, the remedy here is completely different. If there's confusion when to use u and when to use ü, well, that's just a pinyin spelling rule problem, which is pretty easily fixed. But if the problem is that the student can't pronounce ü, well, then that is an articulatory problem, which is not related to pinyin at all. So what I'm saying here essentially is don't mix these things up, and the best way of doing that is to base your listening practice on spoken sounds, on the sound waves themselves, not on the labels we use on the boxes we put these sounds into. If you do that, everything will be less confusing and your pronunciation will be better for it too. There is a potential fix that some people suggest when bringing up these problems that I also did mention in last week's episode, and that is to use a different transcription system such as 注音. and Zhuyin uses symbols that are not the Latin alphabet to label the sounds. So while we have the same problem with labels and sounds being different, at least these symbols are so different from the Latin alphabet that you can't really draw on your knowledge of, say, English or French or Spanish when trying to pronounce them, because we don't use those symbols and we have no connection with them. This is a valid point, which is why I think using Zhuyin, if pronunciation is all you're after, is quite a good idea, or you can learn more than one transcription system. However, there are of course other practical aspects, such as Zhuyin being much less used and Pinyin being more practical in many other regards. The question of which transcription system to use is something I've discussed in a series of articles, and I'll put the link to the first one in the show notes. It's called Learning to Pronounce Mandarin with Pinyin, Zhuyin, and IPA. So, if you want to improve your pronunciation, listen and mimic more, read less, and check out my pronunciation course. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.